friends, the topic of discussion for today is environment and tourism. As all of us are aware that how tourism is a very significant industry, not only from the point of view of generating revenue for the government, but at the same time that how the various tourists they go into different destinations, and it is one point of a leisure for all of them to visit the different places. In the similar manner, environment plays an important role when one is touring various cities in different seasons of the times. So in a way, we find that both of them they share some kind of a symbiotic relationship with each other, in that sense that how tourism in many ways is dependent on environment, and similar is the case when you talk about the environment, that when a number of tourists they visit the places, then the efforts are also made by the government at different levels to promote tourism, and also to in a way make those areas in a way clean, so that more and more tourists they could visit these places. So when we tend to understand their relationship, when we tend to understand that how in a way environment also affects the tourism industry, and tourism, as I have told you, that how it is a very important industry from the point of view of generating revenue, and plays an important role in that sense for the governments across the world. And at the individual level also, we find that how people they go to different destinations for various purposes, and in that we find that at different points of time environment definitely plays an important role. And when you talk about that how tourism also not only generates money within the country, but it is also a great source in that sense for generating the foreign exchange for many developing countries as well. And we find that in many countries the environment, all the natural resources, they are the major assets of these countries, and because of which we find that tourists they also are attracted to these particular places. And when we tend to understand the view of the various experts with regard to what kind of ideas they have, the kind of debates, then we find that how tourism is beneficial, whether it is beneficial or in a way it is harmful for the environment. So we find that if the number of tourists they are limited, if they are visiting these places in the right manner, then definitely they are an asset to the industry. And but at the same time, when we find that more and more people, the number of people increases, and it is not in a way sustainable from the point of view that so many people are crowding that particular place, and they are in a way damaging the ecosystem of that particular place, then we find that it creates problems in that sense. And the countries who are dependent on tourism, we find that the main source of the foreign exchange is an important concern for them. And we also find that when more people they visit these places, then the environment may not be such that it may support such a large number of people in that sense. So we find that how when a large number of people they visit these places, they cause some kind of a damage to the environment or to the land, and it can be permanent in certain cases as well. And the negative effects caused by the tourism industry can be very costly to the country and its population. And some effects include the population, animal and plant extinction, coral reef destruction, inadequate sewage, and destruction or erosion of beaches as well. So these kinds of things they can definitely happen to certain areas, and how they create that kind of an environment which is detrimental from the point of view of the nature. And when you talk about the kind of impact which is being created, we find that the quality of the environment, both natural and the man-made, is essential to tourism. And these kinds of impacts which are there with regard to the environment, such as the roads and the airports and the kind of facilities which are being created at these places in the framework of the resorts or hotels or restaurant shops, golf courses, all these kinds of things which are there. So in that way, we find that tourism has definitely a lot of potential to create positive effect on the environment by contributing to the environmental protection and conservation as well. When you talk about that how tourism industry or tourism development which is happening, the way it can create a lot of pressure on the natural resources when it increases the consumption in that particular area. So we find that at certain levels so it can also create some kind of a conflict among the masses as well. And when we find that a lot of pressure is being created on the natural resources, then the cost of such resources can also increase as well. Many times we find that there are certain cultural problems as well when tourists they visit the areas and they are not very aware about the cultural practices of these areas, and many times they behave in certain manner which is not appreciated by the local people, those who are living there, and they feel that their cultural space is being invaded or in a way it is being mocked upon. Then it may create a situation that it may lead to some kind of conflict as well. And when you talk about that how when you talk about the consequences on the water resources, then we find that the tourism industry in a way overuses the water resources for hotels, swimming pools, etc., and even the personal use of water by the tourists as well. And because of the hot climate and the tendency of the tourists to consume more water when on holiday than they do at home, the water resources are being utilized in a comparatively more, or they are being basically utilized at a larger level. So we find that some studies they have even suggested that the amount used can be almost double what the inhabitants use in a day. And when we see that when environment and tourism industry, both of them they are in a way linked in that manner, and many times the issue of pollution is also there, that how the air emissions are relevant in that context, and the various kinds of concern with regard to the noise, solid waste and the littering, and the releases of various kinds of sewage, oils and chemicals, architectural and visual pollution. So these are the various kinds of pollutions which one can talk about when you find that a lot of tourists they are visiting a number of places. In that context, air emissions are very definitely very relevant in that context as well, because when many tourists they visit and when they use the services maybe of aircraft, maybe the services of the various local taxis and transport, then we find that the use of such taxis and other kinds of transport, we find that there is more emission in certain regions, and some of the regions which did not witness any kind of pollution earlier, nowadays we find that pollution is being witnessed there as well. And we also find that other kinds of pollution, whether the noise pollution is another important concern in that context. Thereafter, we find that how more and more tourists, when they are visiting these places, they release a lot of sewage, and because of which we find that there is some kind of overburden in these areas. And you talk about also the issue of oils and chemicals in that sense, that how it is also an important important contributor to the issue of pollution. And we also see that when one is talking about tourism and how tourism is able to provide a lot of employment to the people, those who are in this sector, and how it is able to create jobs for them, because of which we find that increase in the income and the new jobs they help the people to afford the various consumer goods. And this definitely has some kind of a multiplier effect as well, as you can see on the screen as well. The changing lifestyle and the increased standard of living. For example, the locals, they want better goods and services. So in that sense, we find that these are some of the positive social effects of tourism in that sense. And when people, they get more income and more some kind of a money from the kind of jobs which they are doing, then they are able to afford more consumer goods. And in economy nowadays, there is a lot of focus in that sense that one has to consume more and more goods, because the kind of passion which is there in the people to earn more and to spend more is also increasing in today's world as well. And there is a lot of peer pressure or some kind of a competition between people, or the way people, they try to show off in that context, because of which we find that there is a increase, or there is a kind of change in the lifestyle of the people as well. Then we also see, in the context of better development, when the jobs and the wages, they also help create a demand for the better housing. The people, they want better facilities for them, not only in terms of living, but also in the sense of the recreational facilities as well. And we also see that the way they also spend their money in terms of clothing as well as food, that also increases. And the rising property values in that area, we find that when it is happening, then the property prices, they also increase where near the tourism or facilities that they are being created in these regions. And how the land is also being purchased by the businesses as well. So all these kinds of social effects of tourism could be seen in that context. And when the prices of the property, when they increase and the value increases near the tourism areas, then the other areas which are nearby these areas, they also tend to develop. And many times we find that new kinds of recreational facilities, they are all being created for the tourists as well. And the locals, they get some kind of work in these areas. They are able to absorb themselves in a certain capacity in terms of getting employment in these regions. So all that also happens in this particular manner or concern. And we find that when such kind of development happens in these regions, then not only the locals, they benefit, because many times these people, they are being given certain areas that they have to handle those areas from the tourism point of view, and the locals, they get the jobs in these regions. They are also able to handle those regions, because they are well versed in these areas. And at the same time, when they are living in these areas, so they are also concerned about the environment of these regions, and they do not want any kind of an over exploitation of the various resources. And they are also able to, in a way, conserve or handle the resources in a far better manner than others. And then we also find that when one is exposed to the new ideas, the local residents, they also provide new experiences for the tourists as well, because they are the ones, those who know the best places to visit or eat. So in that sense, they provide a lot of information to the tourists, and then they are also significantly contributing, not only in terms of conservation of the places, but at the same time they are also benefiting in that sense. So this kind of a reciprocal relationship also comes into being when we find that the tourists, they visit. And many times you also find that the tourists, they prefer not only hotels but also homes in these regions, where they can also, when they stay there, then they may come to know about the kinds of lifestyle which the locals live, and the issue can be served in this particular manner. Then many times you also see that some kind of a situation arises where the social effects of tourism are not in a positive manner, they are far negative in that sense, and the resentment towards the sharing resources and facilities is one where tourists, they are seen as some sort of a nuisance. Example, in terms of the sharing of the restaurants, the retail stores, entertainment facilities, that tourists are sharing the same resources and facilities which are being used by the locals, and we find that many times it is also connected to the rise of materialism as well, when we find that the society's preoccupation with money or material possessions, and this could also be seen in the framework of the result of the employment and the better wages as well. So we find that when one is talking about the negative effects of the social effects of tourism, then they are in a way much diverse in that sense, and when the locals are not very happy in terms of sharing their own resources with the tourists, and they are not in a way, they do not want that they may encroach upon the facilities which have been created for them. And we also talked about that how coming of the tourists in large numbers also in a way leads to some kind of a rise of materialism, where the society is preoccupied with money or the material possessions. Many times we also find that the higher crime rates could also be seen, where the crimes on the tourists, they increase over a period of time, and there is a strain on the law enforcement as well. So such kind of situation is not very helpful from the law and order point of view, and the image of that particular region is also affected when any kind of a crime is being committed on the tourists. So this kind of a situation is not good from the point of view of the development of tourism in that particular region. And this also is reflected in the sense that there is a decline in the moral conduct of the local population, and the manifestation of this could be seen in the framework of that how gambling becomes some sort of a major tourist attraction in certain regions, and many times you also find that the prostitution, it also increases. The alcohol and the drug abuse is another important indicator, and we also find that how the divorce rates in many of the regions are also increasing. So in that sense, we find that the negative social effects of tourism are varied in nature, and when one is talking about the issue of crime, then it is directly linked to the question of moral conduct as well. So one has to take care that the crime rates in these regions does not increase, and the moral conduct of the people is also maintained in a certain manner, that all sorts of problems which are there with regard to the alcohol and the drug usage or the question of gambling, all of them is being in a way contained in a certain manner. We also find that how the rising property value of these regions is a concern issue, because when people they get more money, then they are not able to handle it in a comparatively better manner. And when one is talking about the various positives and the negatives, we find that the local residents, they cannot afford housing, and because of which the property values in the beach communities, for example, they are very high. And we also find that the property taxes, they also increase because the land value increases, so the property taxes, they also increase as well. Many times we also find that there is a threat to a culture's native language as well, and how there is a lot of emphasis on relating to the tourists, and the employment qualifications are also very important in that context. And many times we find that the native language is being replaced because the tourists, they are coming, so they are not very much aware about the local language. So the focus is on some kind of a language which is also attractive to the tourists as well. So focus on other languages, that is also there. So some kind of a damage to the indigenous language also happens. So when one is trying to see the various kinds of consequences of tourism from that point of view, and how there is a kind of a benefit of the understanding the environment's impact. So the question of financing for conservation is very, very important, where park fees, lease fees, taxation, grants and donations, all of them, how they are able to generate revenue for the conservation of the environment. Then the question of economic alternatives in the context of the jobs as well. And when you talk about the issue of constituent building, then there is a motivation to conserve as well. Then we see the concerns relating to the impetus for private conservation, the demand for the natural areas, where we find that some people, they are engaged in some sort of a private conservation, and they are also demanding some areas for themselves. So when one is talking about the benefits of understanding the tourism's impact, then one can uncover the potential for the negative impacts or costs. And we also find that the question of discovering the opportunities or the benefits for the tourism to address the social and environmental issues and help in the conservation. So the key issue in this concern is optimization versus the utility maximization, and the way things they go ahead, how they are being given in the kind of assent by the various decision makers, and how they can make changes as well. So in that context, when we try to understand this particular issue, we realize that how environment and tourism, they are intrinsically linked. And when one is talking about tourism, then one has to keep the question of environment always in the mind, then only the tourism potential in any region will develop. And when we are trying to, in a way, address the various concerns or issues which are at the level of the social or environment, and how all of them they are also linked in that sense that all of them, they help in the conservation as well. So the main concern in this particular issue is to how to optimize the kind of resources which are available with oneself, and how, in a way, its utility is to be maximized in a certain manner. And when one is also trying to understand the issue of environment in a larger framework, then one finds that the environment definitely plays an important role in terms of deciding the potential of that region, whether that potential particularly has more avenues for the tourism development. And when tourism develops in that particular region because of the environmental concerns, so definitely it plays an important role in terms of providing not only employment to the people, but at the same time it is also generating a lot of revenue for the government. So the tourism industry is not only in that sense that it is dependent on the foreign tourists, but at the same time we find that the local tourists, they definitely play an important role when they visit these places. So in the larger framework, this issue of environment and tourism has been relevant for all times, and definitely all of them, both of them, they have created a lot of concern in the minds of the people, those who are connected to these disciplines. So in that larger context, when we tend to understand the issues of both these environment as well as tourism, then we find that many times when tourism is at its peak and more people they are visiting certain areas, then it may have some kind of a detrimental impact on that particular region. So the need is that how some kind of balance is being created, and the focus should be there in the question of development, but at the same time we have to also see that any development in the tourism sector should not be at the expense of environment, and the idea of sustainable development has been a relevant issue in this concern when one is talking about the concerns relating to the environment. So when we are saying all these kinds of ideas with regard to the tourism and the concern of the environment, we realize that the tourism industry is only going to survive when it will keep its focus on the environment, and when the environment of that particular region will be in a way sustained or it will be conserved, then only the tourism will thrive as well. So with this I'd like to end the discussion. We'll talk about the issues of environment and tourism in our next lecture. Thank you very much.